Ego. The greatest enemy every man must conquer. The ego is often seen as one of the most powerful forces within a man. It's that internal voice that craves recognition, power, and validation. It pushes men to seek status, to prove themselves in every situation, to make sure their presence is felt in every room. On the surface, this might seem like a natural drive for success, but the truth is much darker. The ego is a deceptive force. It blinds you, distorting your perception of who you really are and what truly matters in life. From an early age, men are taught to project strength, whether through sports, social status, or in the pursuit of wealth and power. Men are encouraged to constantly strive for dominance. The ego feeds on this, whispering in your ear that you need to be the best at everything. It convinces you that your worth is directly tied to how others perceive you. But the harsh reality is this: when you let your ego dictate your actions, you're no longer in control. You're simply reacting to the desires of a false sense of superiority. Ego manifests in various ways, and many men don't even realize when it's driving them. It could be the need to always have the last word in an argument. It could be refusing to accept criticism, even when it's constructive. Or it could be that constant hunger for admiration and praise, seeking validation from others rather than finding satisfaction within yourself. When ego takes over, your focus shifts from personal growth to the endless pursuit of external approval. This is a dangerous path. Perhaps the most common manifestation of ego is pride, the kind of pride that refuses to admit weakness or failure, that makes a man reject help even when he needs it the most. This pride isn't a sign of strength. It's a weakness in disguise. And that's where many men fall. They confuse the ego's demands for strength, when in reality, it's just fear wrapped in arrogance. Fear of being seen as weak, fear of failure, and fear of not living up to the expectations that society has placed on their shoulders. The truth is, the ego can make a man a slave to his own insecurities. A man driven by ego is constantly seeking to prove something, to himself, to others, to the world. But real strength doesn't come from proving your worth to others. Real strength comes from within, from knowing who you are and standing firm in that truth, regardless of what anyone else thinks. Letting the ego run your life is like living in a cage of your own making. It limits your growth, your ability to learn from others, and your capacity for genuine connections. In essence, the ego holds you back from becoming the man you are truly meant to be. You can either be controlled by your ego, or you can master it. The choice is yours. When a man is consumed by his ego, he often falls into three dangerous traps: pride, arrogance, and vanity. These traits, while seemingly different, all stem from the same core issue: an inflated sense of self-importance. Each of these traps feeds the ego, leading a man further away from his true potential and deeper into a cycle of self-deception. Pride is perhaps the most subtle and dangerous of these traps. Pride convinces you that you are always right, that admitting mistakes is a sign of weakness, and that you must always appear infallible in the eyes of others. It builds walls around you, making it impossible to grow or improve because it blinds you to your own flaws. A man who is driven by pride can't accept criticism, even when it's constructive. He'll dismiss advice from others, convinced that he already knows everything he needs to succeed. In reality, pride stops progress dead in its tracks. Instead of becoming better, a prideful man remains stagnant, trapped in his own illusion of superiority. Arrogance, on the other hand, is the outward expression of an overblown ego. It's the belief that you are better than everyone else, that you deserve more simply because of who you are. Arrogance makes you look down on others, creating distance between you and the people around you. It fosters resentment, not respect. The arrogant man believes that rules don't apply to him, that he is entitled to special treatment, and that others should recognize his greatness without question. But what he fails to see is that arrogance is a sign of insecurity, not strength. The truly confident man doesn't need to boast or elevate himself above others. His actions speak for him. Vanity is the final trap, and it's perhaps the most toxic of the three. Vanity is the ego's obsession with appearance, how you look, how you're perceived, how much attention you can command from others. The vain man is always concerned with the superficial, always chasing validation from the outside world. He derives his sense of worth from how much admiration he can garner, whether through physical appearance, material possessions, or social status. But this is a hollow pursuit. Vanity leads a man to prioritize style over substance, appearance over authenticity. The more he chases after the approval of others, the more disconnected he becomes from his true self. All three of these traps, pride, arrogance, and vanity, are symptoms of a deeper problem, a fragile sense of identity. When a man is unsure of who he truly is, when he lacks a strong internal foundation, he turns to the ego for validation. He becomes consumed with the need to project an image of success, power, and dominance. But the truth is, these qualities are fleeting and ultimately unfulfilling. A man who is ruled by his ego will never be satisfied, because there will always be someone stronger, richer, or more admired than him. The ego craves constant feeding, and no matter how much you give it, it will always demand more. These traps are not just obstacles to personal success. They are barriers to genuine connection with others. Pride makes it impossible to form deep, meaningful relationships because it prevents you from being vulnerable. Arrogance alienates the people around you, pushing away those who might otherwise support and help you grow. And vanity ensures that your relationships are shallow, based on appearances rather than true connection. The man who falls into these traps ultimately sabotages himself. He becomes isolated, disconnected from those around him, and unable to see the world with clarity. The ego promises strength and superiority, but in reality, it leads to weakness and emptiness. To escape these traps, a man must first recognize them for what they are: illusions that serve the ego, but destroy the soul. One of the most destructive aspects of the ego is its effect on relationships. Whether it's with friends, family, or romantic partners, the ego can poison the connections that matter most. A man ruled by his ego struggles to maintain genuine relationships because his need to be seen as superior often takes precedence over the needs of others. In every interaction, the ego seeks dominance, control, and validation, which turns relationships into power struggles rather than mutual partnerships. In friendships, ego-driven men often feel the need to compete with their peers, seeing every success or achievement as something that threatens their own status. Instead of celebrating a friend's victories, the ego becomes envious, pushing the man to constantly compare himself and measure his worth against others. This creates distance and resentment, eroding the bond that true friendship is built on. A real friendship requires mutual respect and support, but the ego cannot tolerate someone else's success unless it surpasses their own. In romantic relationships, the ego can be even more damaging. Many men, in an effort to maintain control or assert their dominance, fail to truly listen to their partners. They may dismiss their partner's needs or opinions, always trying to be the one in charge, the one who is right. But a relationship built on the ego's need for control is destined to fail. A healthy relationship is based on vulnerability, communication, and compromise, qualities that the ego sees as weaknesses. The ego thrives on the idea of never admitting fault, of always appearing strong and unshakable. But in a romantic relationship, this leads to emotional distance, frustration, and eventual breakdown. It's not uncommon for a man to sabotage his own relationships because he cannot let go of his ego. He may refuse to apologize, even when he knows he's in the wrong, because to do so would mean admitting weakness. But here's the reality: refusing to admit fault is not strength, it's insecurity. True strength in a relationship comes from being able to own your mistakes, to admit when you've hurt someone, and to make things right. A man who can't do that is not leading with strength, but with fear. Fear of losing control, fear of being vulnerable, and fear of being seen as anything less than perfect. In professional relationships, the ego can be equally harmful. Whether in the workplace or in business, a man driven by ego will often find it hard to collaborate. He may be unwilling to share credit, always seeking to be the center of attention, or he may reject the ideas of others, believing his own to be superior. This not only hinders teamwork, but also isolates him from valuable input and insights that could lead to growth and success. The ego doesn't allow for open-mindedness, and as a result, opportunities are missed. Colleagues may begin to avoid working with him, and leaders may see him as difficult to manage. In the end, it's not his talent or skill that holds him back. It's his inability to set aside his ego and work with others as equals. Another major issue is that the ego makes it nearly impossible to build trust. Trust is the foundation of any strong relationship, and it requires honesty, vulnerability, and authenticity. But when a man is governed by his ego, he's always wearing a mask, always trying to project an image of perfection or invulnerability. This facade prevents real connection. Others sense that they're not seeing the true person behind the mask, and this creates distance and suspicion. It's hard to trust someone who is constantly posturing, who never admits mistakes, and who is more concerned with appearance than with truth. Ultimately, the ego creates a wall between a man and the people in his life. It isolates him, leaving him feeling disconnected and alone even if he's surrounded by others. The more a man lets his ego dictate his actions, the more he pushes people away, leaving him to wonder why his relationships are unfulfilling or why they fall apart. To build strong, lasting relationships, a man must be willing to put his ego aside. He must be able to listen, to support others without needing anything in return, and to value the relationship itself over his need to be seen as superior. True connection comes not from asserting dominance, but from showing empathy, respect, and humility. The more a man can release the grip of his ego, the more he can foster genuine relationships that enrich his life and bring him true fulfillment. One of the greatest obstacles to a man's growth is his ego. The ego tricks you into believing that you already know everything you need to succeed, that your way is the best way, and that admitting you don't know something is a sign of weakness. But in truth, the ego is the enemy of learning and self-improvement. When a man is controlled by his ego, he becomes closed off to new ideas, experiences, and perspectives, ultimately halting his own progress. At the core of learning is the acknowledgement that you don't know everything. To evolve, a man must remain curious, open to new information, and willing to admit that he has much to learn. But the ego resists this. It thrives on certainty and control, convincing you that you have all the answers and that admitting ignorance is a threat to your pride. This mindset keeps you stuck, repeating the same patterns and mistakes, never moving forward. But a man ruled by ego cannot do this. He cannot face his own shortcomings because his pride won't allow it. This is where the ego becomes a true enemy. It doesn't just block new knowledge, it actively resists it. A man consumed by his ego will dismiss others' ideas simply because they weren't his own. He will reject feedback, even if it's constructive, because accepting it would mean admitting that he's not perfect. And in this refusal to listen and learn, he limits his potential. The ego also stifles evolution by making a man afraid of failure. The fear of looking foolish or inadequate keeps many men from taking risks, trying new things, or stepping out of their comfort zones. They stay in the same place, doing the same things, because the ego tells them that's where they're safe. But this is a false sense of security. Real growth only happens when you step into the unknown, when you're willing to fail and learn from that failure. If you let your ego dictate your actions, you will never take those necessary steps. The most successful men understand that failure is not the end, it's part of the process. Every mistake, every setback is an opportunity to learn and improve. But if your ego makes you afraid to fail, you'll never take the necessary risks that lead to true growth. In this sense, the ego is not just the enemy of learning, it's the enemy of success itself. Another aspect of this is the inability to accept advice or mentorship. Many men, driven by their egos, reject the idea of learning from others. They feel that seeking help or guidance is a sign of weakness. They want to be seen as self-made, independent, and strong. But the truth is, no man can do it alone. Even the greatest leaders and thinkers had mentors, people who guided them and helped them see the world from new perspectives. A man who refuses to learn from others because of his ego is cutting himself off from invaluable wisdom and experience. What many men fail to realize is that the act of learning and evolving is a lifelong process. There is no finish line. No matter how much success you achieve, no matter how much you know, there is always more to learn. The world is constantly changing, and those who refuse to adapt, who refuse to grow, will inevitably be left behind. A man who lets his ego control him will stop evolving the moment he starts to believe he's already reached the top. In the end, the man who cannot control his ego will be his own worst enemy. He will sabotage his own potential, limit his own opportunities, and fail to evolve into the man he could be. To truly grow, a man must be humble enough to admit that he doesn't know everything, brave enough to embrace failure, and wise enough to learn from those around him. Only by conquering the ego can a man unlock his full potential. It's a simple truth. The more you think you know, the less you are willing to learn, and the less you learn, the less you grow. If you want to evolve, you must first defeat the ego that holds you back. The battle against the ego is not an easy one, but it is absolutely essential if you want to live a life of purpose, fulfillment, and true strength. Controlling the ego requires a combination of humility, discipline, and deep self-awareness. These qualities, when cultivated consistently, can help a man master his ego and prevent it from dominating his decisions and relationships. Let's break down how each of these virtues plays a crucial role in taming the ego. First, humility is the cornerstone of controlling the ego. To be humble doesn't mean to be weak or submissive. It means having an honest understanding of your own limitations and being open to learning and growth. Humility allows you to see yourself as you truly are, rather than through the distorted lens of the ego. A humble man is not threatened by the success of others. He doesn't feel the need to prove himself constantly, or to elevate himself above anyone else. Instead, he is secure in who he is, knowing that he is always a work in progress. Humility also teaches you to listen. A man driven by ego always talks, always asserts his own opinion, and rarely considers the perspectives of others. But a humble man understands the power of listening. Really listening. He values the input of others, whether it's from friends, family, colleagues, or even strangers. He knows that every person he meets has something to teach him, and he is not afraid to admit when someone else's idea is better than his own. This mindset not only fosters personal growth, but also strengthens relationships, as people are naturally drawn to those who respect and value their input. Discipline is another critical element in keeping the ego in check. The ego thrives on instant gratification, constantly seeking praise, recognition, and validation. But real growth and success come from discipline, the ability to delay gratification and to focus on long-term goals rather than short-term rewards. A man who lacks discipline will be a slave to his ego, constantly chasing approval and feeding his pride. But a disciplined man knows that true strength comes from the ability to control his impulses, to stay focused on his goals, and to keep working towards them, even when no one is watching. Discipline also means being able to control your reactions. When the ego is challenged, it often triggers feelings of anger, frustration, or defensiveness. A disciplined man, however, doesn't let his emotions dictate his actions. He remains calm, collected, and in control, even when faced with criticism or adversity. He understands that reacting impulsively out of pride or ego will only lead to regret and missed opportunities. Instead, he takes the time to think through his responses, ensuring that they align with his values and long-term objectives rather than his immediate emotional needs. Autoconsciousness, or self-awareness, is the third pillar in controlling the ego. Without self-awareness, a man cannot see the influence the ego has on his actions and decisions. He may think he's acting out of confidence or strength, when in reality it's his ego leading him astray. Self-awareness is the ability to observe your own thoughts, emotions, and behaviors with clarity and honesty. It's the practice of checking in with yourself regularly and asking, am I acting out of ego right now? Is my pride taking control? Am I making decisions based on what's best for me or just to protect my image? The ego can be sneaky. It often disguises itself as confidence or ambition. But a self-aware man can spot the difference. He knows that confidence comes from a place of inner security, while ego comes from a place of fear. Fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear of being seen as weak. The more self-aware a man becomes, the easier it is to recognize when his ego is trying to take control, and the more capable he becomes of shutting it down before it causes harm. Developing self-awareness also means being able to accept your flaws. No man is perfect, and the ego hates to admit that. But true self-awareness requires you to confront your weaknesses head-on, without judgment or denial. The more honest you can be with yourself about your shortcomings, the more you can work to overcome them. A man who avoids this self-reflection, out of fear or pride, will never grow. All of these qualities, humility, discipline, and self-awareness, work together to keep the ego in check. Humility keeps you grounded, discipline keeps you focused, and self-awareness ensures that you're always in control of your actions, rather than letting your ego take the reins. The man who masters these qualities not only overcomes his ego, but also becomes a true leader. A man who inspires respect through his actions, not his words, and who seeks to lift others up rather than put them down. It's important to understand that controlling the ego is not a one-time battle. It's a lifelong practice. The ego will always be there, waiting for moments of weakness to reassert itself. But the more you practice humility, discipline, and self-awareness, the stronger you become at resisting its pull. Remember, true strength comes from within. Not from dominating others, not from seeking constant validation, but from mastering yourself. Mastering your ego is one of the greatest victories a man can achieve. It's not about destroying the ego entirely, that's impossible, but rather learning how to control it and prevent it from controlling you. When you achieve this, you unlock a path to true greatness, a greatness that is not dependent on the approval of others or on external achievements, but one that comes from within. This inner greatness is far more powerful and lasting than anything the ego can offer. To conquer the ego is to liberate yourself from the constant need for validation. Most men spend their lives chasing external symbols of success, money, power, fame, thinking that these will fill the void inside them. But the reality is, no amount of external success can ever satisfy a man whose life is controlled by his ego. The ego always wants more, and the more you feed it, the hungrier it becomes. True greatness, however, comes when you no longer seek to prove yourself to anyone, when your actions are driven by purpose, not by the desire for recognition. This is a profound shift in mindset. When you stop caring about how others perceive you, you are free to live according to your own values, your own principles. You no longer waste energy trying to maintain an image or trying to outshine others. Instead, you focus on becoming the best version of yourself, not to impress others, but because you know it's the right thing to do. A man who has mastered his ego doesn't need to announce his successes or seek approval. His confidence comes from knowing that he is on his own path, moving steadily toward his goals regardless of what others think. The victory over the ego also leads to deeper, more meaningful relationships. When the ego no longer dictates your interactions, you are able to connect with others on a more genuine level. You no longer see people as competitors or as tools to boost your own self-esteem. Instead, you value them for who they are, and you build relationships based on mutual respect and understanding. This allows for true collaboration, where everyone benefits and grows together. It also creates space for vulnerability, something the ego fears but is essential for real emotional intimacy. Another key to greatness is the ability to learn from failure. Men who are ruled by their ego often fear failure so much that they avoid taking risks. Or worse, they make excuses for their failures instead of learning from them. But a man who has defeated his ego understands that failure is not the enemy. It's a teacher. Every failure is an opportunity to learn, to grow, and to improve. When you let go of the fear of looking weak or foolish, you become unstoppable. You are willing to take risks, to push your limits because you know that even if you fall, you will get back up stronger. This mindset, where failure is embraced rather than feared, allows a man to achieve things that others can only dream of. Most men are held back by their egos, afraid to step out of their comfort zones or to admit that they don't have all the answers. But the man who has mastered his ego knows that true greatness is not about avoiding failure, but about rising above it. He knows that every setback is part of the journey, and that the real test of a man's character is how he responds to those setbacks. Perhaps the greatest reward for defeating the ego is the sense of peace that comes with it. When you are no longer driven by ego, you find that life becomes simpler and more fulfilling. You are no longer chasing after things that don't matter, status, recognition, or approval. Instead, you are focused on what truly matters, your own growth, your relationships, and your contributions to the world. You are no longer trying to be better than others. You are simply trying to be better than you were yesterday. This is the essence of true greatness. It's not about how much money you make, how many people admire you, or how powerful you become. True greatness comes from mastering yourself, from having the discipline, humility, and wisdom to live according to your own values, regardless of what others think. It's about creating a life that is meaningful, not because of the external rewards, but because of the internal satisfaction of knowing you are living up to your full potential. In the end, the victory over the ego is not just a victory over a part of yourself. It's a victory over the limitations that the world tries to impose on you. When you are free from the ego's demands, you are free to pursue your own path, to define success on your own terms, and to live a life of purpose and fulfillment. This is the true path to greatness, not the hollow achievements that the ego chases, but the deep, lasting fulfillment that comes from knowing you are living your life to the fullest, with integrity, wisdom, and strength. To achieve this level of mastery is no small feat. It requires constant vigilance, a commitment to personal growth, and the willingness to face uncomfortable truths about yourself. But the rewards are worth the effort. A man who has mastered his ego is a man who cannot be shaken by failure, by criticism, or by the opinions of others. He is a man who leads not by force but by example, inspiring others not with his words but with his actions. And in that, he finds true greatness. Think about it. The most successful people in any field are those who are constantly learning, constantly pushing themselves to improve. They don't rest on their laurels or assume they've reached the peak of their abilities. Instead, they embrace their weaknesses, learn from their failures, and seek out advice and knowledge from others.